Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we take a look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our general joy of being alive. And of course, in order to do that, we also have to talk about sustainability in design as well. And on that, I've got a guest that her life is dedicated to sustainability and healthy buildings for us humans. Helena van Vliet, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe.
It seems like we've been waiting for a long time for this to happen. I'm glad to finally get to speak with you. Let's start by getting to know you a little bit. Tell us why you chose architecture as a career in the first place, and then tell us about the path that led you to becoming a biophilic design consultant.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. Architecture is pretty easy because my father was an architect. He had his own firm in Germany. I had a whole bunch of uncles and cousins who were architects. I had a great-grandfather who's a builder, so it was a built-in situation maybe. It actually never really occurred to me to do anything else, to tell you the truth. A biophilic design is a little bit more complicated maybe. My father was a post-war architect, so I grew up in a Bauhaus cube, floor to ceiling, concrete, glass, that type of thing, tasteful shades of beige and gray. And I had a younger brother who was disabled from birth, and he died relatively young. And when that happened, there was a great deal of trauma and turmoil in my family for many years. And so I headed outdoors, essentially. I headed into the garden, especially into the unkempt part of the garden, which in Germany is hard to find. And there was this old apple tree, and I spent a great deal of time in that apple tree, actually. So that was really my safe place. And to tell you the truth, it still is. Whenever there's a problem or there's an issue, my feet automatically take me outside. And I start every day outdoors with my birds, the bunnies, and, sitting there having my tea. So, yeah, it is something that has always been with me. And I think as an architect, I always wanted to connect people with nature and design buildings that became a medium for people to connect with nature. A lot of times we build buildings to keep nature out. And I wanted to I don't want leaking buildings and all that sort of thing. I've been a practicing architect for 40 years, but I wanted this interactive relationship with nature, because I realized how healing that was for me and still is. And I really want that for everyone, certainly for my clients, but all the users of my buildings. So I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Professor Decker Keltner from Berkeley on awe, but he refers to these everyday awe moments that we experience, what he calls, I think, the vastness and the smallness, and so bringing that into our experience, not just once a year when we go on vacation somewhere, but really every day. That's been a big thing for me. So as an architect, I also like to bring nature inside. When we dig a foundation, I always look through the stones, the rocks, and I like to set them somewhere indoors. I like to work with wood. I like foundation walls that come out of the ground, gently, like a tree does. I like to do topographic design so the building kind of tucks in, all those type of things to really make the building a gentle presence on the site.
A gentle presence. What a lovely way to put it. And so the clients that seek you out would want this gentle presence more so than the McMansion, the gaudy, the over the top. You know what I'm talking about. We've all driven down those particular roads in Florida and those kind of, where it's just maximizing in size and shiny parts. So
Yeah.
I love this idea of gentleness. I want to try something new today, Elena, in the way that we get at this. I'd like to learn about your style and your technique and your goals for your client by asking them from the perspective of the client. Okay. So when we talk about your work as an architect, what is it that you want to bring to your clients? And you've talked about it a little bit in your introduction, but let's just, let's explore it again. And then what would you like for your clients to say about your work after they move in, after it's complete?
Right, so I have to answer this a little bit in a multi-track way. I actually don't mention the term biophilic design very often with my clients because, and as you know, I have done a lot of research in the sciences to kind of reverse engineer my own design process in a way. But so for them or for anyone I'm working for, my main goal is for them to feel at home in that place. So, and it always starts with the place and with the community of life in that place that is there before we start. I remember my very first project, which was in a woodland, and I was distraught because construction is actually destruction a lot of times. And, I sat there for an entire day trying to understand what was happening there already. And then I discovered eventually there was actually a clearing between these oak trees. And then I designed a building that fit exactly into this clearing. And we very carefully cut the roots that we had to. And I'm happy to report none of the oaks died. That was 30 some years ago. So what I want for them is design for well-being, right? I teach courses that are called environments for well-being. And from a scientific point of view, that would mean places where homeostasis can be effective. Homeostasis, of course, is the imperative of all living organism, and it has to do with the optimization of physiological energy, right? So when we are in environments that align with our innate biology, our energy budget is optimized, the management is optimized, whereas in environments where we are not, that's a chronic stress environment, the opposite is the case. We're using a lot of energy just to get through the day that we then don't have available for creativity, relationships, and any of those type of things. And there's a lot that we agree on, it turns out, as a species and interspecies too, about what feels safe, what feels comfortable. It is by no means as personal as we had imagined it to be. There's a lot that we share because a lot of these preferences we inherited through evolution, and they're directly related to survival. And they focus, if you want to summarize it, on evolutionarily relevant survival imperatives. In place ingredients like flowing water or, dappled sunlight. So the tree canopy is not too dense, not too open, just so we're elevated, our backs are protected, we're overlooking something where things are happening, refuge and prospect, we call that in biophilic design, right? So those are opportunities that we bring in, and everyone agrees that these are really wonderful spaces. It's not very complicated in the end. Nobody likes to sit in the middle of a restaurant if the tables around the edges are available, that type of thing.
Right. Interesting. Something you said in your introduction, and then this second question that we're looking at now, it intrigues me. We've created buildings to protect ourselves, to keep ourselves safe, to give us a relatively controlled environment that we can engage in things and stuff, creating art or doing other types of work, whatever, cooking, that all of those things. Yet, it appears that we've gone way too far in isolating ourselves from the natural
Yes.
world. Is that a fair statement of the state of the current status quo in building creation?
Yeah, of course, my profession has very high liability, right? So everyone is just trying to build the same box all over again, pretty much, because that keeps the lawyers away. There's
Right.
that bit. But also the word you mentioned a minute ago, control. Humans are a little bit very focused on control, which of course is kind of a fear-based emotion, if you will. But what happens is we pay a huge price for this because we know that our immune system only functions when we are actually in direct contact with biodiverse natural environments. Our gut microbiome, where 70+% of our immune cells are located, does not function well in concrete and asphalt dominated environments. We're sitting ducks for the next virus. We have a lot more inflammation, which is the underlying condition for pretty much every illness. So we pay a price that we don't seem to be aware of a lot of times. And, I say that I consider architecture a healthcare profession, right? Because once you look into the science and the fact that no place or space is ever physiologically neutral, anywhere, any space we enter, we have the autonomic nervous systems in a less than split second decision determines what kind of a place this is. Got to get out of here. Really nice, would love to sit down. Too hot, too cold, stuffy, claustrophobic, exposed, really doesn't feel safe. All this stuff, none of that reaches consciousness until later. Some of it reaches consciousness later, some of it never does, a lot of it never does. But once we understand from neuroscience that 90% plus of our place experience is non-conscious, at least very much initially, it just wipes out the entire way we teach architecture currently, basically. And we need to go back to the drawing board and really understand that we are designing physiologically relevant experience places, that can either sabotage well-being or support well-being, that can send our blood pressure and our heart rate through the roof or calm it, and we have an awesome responsibility to understand that, first of all. It's not how architecture is taught in most places that I'm aware of. So once we understand that, we also then get to the point where we realize that the Cartesian split that we've been living under for 400 years, that somehow mind and body are separate and somehow mind is superior, that has been thrown out completely by cognitive neuroscience. Never did make any sense to me, to tell you the truth. But now we work with non-dualistic embodied cognition. So we know that, for instance, via the vagus nerve, 80% of the information goes up to the brain. So the brain takes dictation from the body, right? So there's this, when we come into a built environment or any environment, there's this huge amount of information that comes in via our senses. And we have a lot more than 5, like 20 to 30, that informs the body physiology, whether this is a place that meets these evolutionary relevant survival imperatives or not. And if it's the way a lot of our cities are, concrete, glass, asphalt, noise, too much light, too much noise, bad air, there's nothing here. Everything here says evolutionary relevant scarcity. So cortisol is elevated, right? And if that happens chronically, we wind up with inflammatory conditions that can lead to any number of illnesses, right? So it is definitely a healthcare profession. And I think, I talk about the Hippocratic Oath in my courses, first of all, do no harm. Right? So let's not design stuff where people are chronically stressed. Once we understand that, we really have no option. But as I mentioned, a lot of architecture schools that I'm aware of still focus on what does it look like, which is a tiny part of the conversation. I can design a hospital that looks great, but if I haven't controlled for the noise level, the olfactory components, the temperature, the humidity of the air, the views, the whole physiological experience, I've only done a tiny bit of what I'm really responsible for.
Is natural light one of the evolutionary imperatives? Sunshine?
Yes, but absolutely. I mean, we were designed to be out in nature 100%, and now we are in buildings 90% of the time. And the rest of the time we're standing on asphalt, So the built environments that we've created, for the most part, are misaligned with our innate biology. I mean, our biology hasn't changed in 1920 or 1875 or 1649. Right. It's the same way it has been since the mammoth hunters, right? So, but for some reason, we are insisting on stuffing people into boxes. And, I talk a lot about efficiency. We have created this notion of efficiency that 2,000 people in a box is very efficient. Well, once we look at this from a physiological point of view, this is super inefficient because these people are stressed, unproductive, sicker, call it high turnover. This is not an efficient way to design buildings.
I agree entirely.
One more comment about the
Yeah.
light, excuse me. Daylight, yes, but dynamic daylight. So not glare, but this filtered sunlight through a tree canopy, a light tree canopy, and then really we've evolved in a light that is all, goes sort of all around us. So I often see buildings where there's floor to ceiling glass, but it's only in one sun orientation, which creates glare. And you see the
Yep.
blinds are down all the time because people don't like it. And glare is also interesting because it changes the depth perception inside of the space, which makes people feel unsure of where things are. So cortisol goes up again.
Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful, natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Interesting. I've never heard that before, and that makes a lot of sense. That makes a whole lot of sense, but I've never heard that as one of the reasons why glare is so uncomfortable for us. But
Yeah, very
that,
uncomfortable.
oh my gosh, that's so important. Thank you for making sure that point got out there. Let's talk about edge conditions. Your work emphasizes the importance of edge conditions. Can you define that for us and explain, why these sorts of transitional spaces are so important for us?
Right, so maybe it started with the Bauhaus cube, that
Yeah.
I grew up in, which you were either inside or outside, and you had very harsh edges. But in the 1990s, I read a book, a very interesting book called Ecological Design by Sim van der Rijn. I think there's another author, name I can't recall. And it mentioned the term ecotones. It's a term in biology which describes these sort of liminal spaces between two different ecosystems, let's say a forest and a meadow. So the space in between is an ecotone, and it's sort of a overlapping, and it's particularly biodiverse rich. So ecotones are particularly biodiverse rich places. And they also coincide with this refuge prospect imperative in evolution, that we're coming out of a covered space into an open space. We take a pause, we take a breath, we survey the possibilities. So ecotones are these quintessential edge conditions. I have some brand new bunnies here in my garden. They're about the size of my hand. And you can see that they never go far from the edges, the edges of bushes, the edges of the trees. They're always like within reach. In case of a problem, they can tuck under. And we're the same way. It's referred to as stigmotaxis in biology. It's that tendency of all biological organisms really to kind of stick to the edges. Animals tend to not run through the middle, they run along the edges. And we are the same way. We are the same way. We like to have the opportunity to tuck under in case of inclement weather, there is a problem. And we celebrate that actually as a design feature. If you look at famous public spaces like the Piazza San Marco, the Plaza de España in Seville, elaborate colonnades, elaborate, open edge conditions with layers of depth where I can get out of the hot sun, out of the rain, out of the snow, or whatever else might be happening. And we know that, for instance, in retail settings, buildings that have closed edges, just sort of glass facades, people tend to walk past faster. They don't linger as much because it inherently feels, just too exposed. Yeah. So it's something that I started to focus on a great deal because it's also the edge conditions of a lot of our hard buildings that cause a lot of problems in terms of bird collisions, for example.
Right. It's completely undefinable edge if you're a bird. Zero transition. Let's talk about one of your essays. It was called Buildings as Habitat. You talk about designing environments that support both people and wildlife, and I love this concept. I've had one conversation about this before. How can architects balance the human needs with ecological considerations, especially in our cities and our more densely populated areas? How do you get that balance in an urban setting?
Well, first of all, we need to understand that they're the same consideration. Again, with respect to the immune system, we're not okay unless we are in direct contact with nature on a microbiome level, on like a immune system microbiome gut level, literally gut level, which is where most of our immune cells reside. So we're not actually okay. So there actually cannot be a separation between the two. If we are just out of self-interest, there cannot be in terms of public health. By the way, there's also new research in terms of interior space, the microbiome of interior spaces, because we spend so much time indoors, living walls, what do they contribute to the microbiome of interior spaces? But we know that children who grow up in denatured environments have a compromised immune system from day one of their life. This is the ultimate inequity, really, and the American Allergy Association refers to this as an uneducated immune system. So really where they're sitting ducks for whatever comes along, So once we figure out the cost of not doing nature in cities in terms of public health, and again, think about the issue we discussed with energy optimization a few minutes ago. It becomes unaffordable not to do that, really, when you really understand how this all goes together. So buildings as habitat focuses again on homeostatic efficiency or effectiveness in terms of our biology, and really it's the same as the biology of all other organisms. We're soft bodies, we like soft edges, and an issue that is particularly critical in most of our cities is extreme heat. They're not designed to really deal with that without air conditioning. So we turn on the air conditioning, at least those of us who can afford it. A lot of the world cannot. And we make it even hotter in our cities. So we crank it up even more. So this is obviously not a sustainable business model, right? And it makes it even harder for the birds outside and everyone else who is outdoors in Phoenix, that fell out of the sky a few summers ago from heat exhaustion, from lack of food and water and everything else. So I write in that essay about birds as sort of the canaries in the gold mine that really teach us in a very tragic way the errors of our ways, not just for them, but for us ourselves. This, what you mentioned a minute ago, the separation from nature that we have pursued, even in the Cartesian split in our own body between mind and body, we've pursued that erroneously. So bringing this all back together around the issue of really immune system strength. We found out with COVID what happens when people's immune systems are compromised, how much more vulnerable they are. So I became really interested in the edge conditions of buildings as in terms of habitat design, right? And full disclosure, my daughter is an expert in bryophytes, in epiphytes, in mosses. I have a picture behind me here of ferns growing on trees. So I learned a lot about how trees do these edge conditions, create these microhabitats on the bark, and these benefit the tree. They don't harm the tree, they benefit the tree because they protect the interior climate of the tree, very similar to what we're trying to do with our vertical structures, i.e. buildings. They protect the moisture level, they sequester additional carbon, they create soil layers, all that is beneficial to the tree. And also they create a habitat for insects and therefore for birds. I live in a house that's covered with ivy, and it's just wonderful to see how many birds' nests there are. Even right now, for example, see them feed, see them build the nests, and flying squirrels that I can see really up close to my windows, incredibly sweet. So what we need, and it occurred to me that why are we building these buildings? Nature has figured a lot of this stuff out already, right? And here we are building buildings that generate more heat, that reverberate the noise amongst each other, that absorb no dust, kill 1 billion birds in the United States alone, lots of light, lots of noise, and then it just amounts to an environment that is totally out of alignment with our own biology. So nature's figured this out already. So what if we just kind of learned to future-proof our buildings and have them become very adaptive and actually self-cooling buildings, because we have energy needs with the data centers, going through the roof that we're not sure we can really meet at the moment. So buildings that are not entirely dependent on mechanical systems, but can be passively survivable in terms of power outages, and that also become good neighbors in terms of the ecosystem of the neighborhood, feeding birds, providing habitat and providing us with these everyday awe experiences that we know from research. We know that actually awe experiences reduce inflammation more than any other emotion, inflammatory cytokines. So it's
Interesting.
extremely, so it's this constant win-win scenario thing that we're really looking to do. So yeah, and I talk in that essay about these vertical vegetation systems, right? That we, in a lot of cities, we don't have enough room on the ground to plant enough trees to do what we need to do. So really thinking of this as verdant blankets that we can pull up the facades over the roofs and down on the other side. And there are a lot of cable systems available, a lot of different ways to do it. And Audubon recommends that they're at maximum 3 feet away from the glass to protect birds. But yeah, so let's just see how trees do it. They've already figured it out and really basically copy that and have a lot more sustainable building system and multiply that in terms of the system of the organism of the city, have a series of immune cells, essentially, each building being a little immune cell that we can then add together.
Have you been able to successfully implement any of those strategies? I know you're involved with biophilic that works to integrate biodiversity in Philadelphia, in urban Philadelphia. Have any of those, have you been able to implement any of those strategies in bringing biophilia into the urban setting and have them actually thrive and achieve the objectives of, a healthier sort of biome?
Well, I have on all my buildings that I design myself, I always have plants growing over them to the point where it's hard to photograph them sometimes, which I really enjoy. And Biophily is a very small volunteer organization, and we really focused there on, well, first of all, on making the connection between nature in cities and public health. So it's not a luxury item. It is a must-have for public health, right? Connecting these. So at our conferences, we bring together designers and medical professionals a lot of times to talk about the same thing. But we wanted to, at Biophily, we also focused on the emotional connection to nature. So it's not something theoretical, nice to have when we have time, but something that I can accomplish this emotional connection in a flower pot on my balcony, something that's doable in my front backyard. That is, I don't have to get on a plane to go there. It's something that I
Right.
have the opportunity to do right now, right here. I can watch that bumblebee in my flower pot, that type of thing. So these are these everyday awe experiences that we discussed, right?
I love that.
And
Love
we
that.
also know that, when we add more nature, that reduces stress levels in neighborhoods. So there's less violence, there's a more peaceful cooperation. It's better for retail. I mean, the whole thing, it's a win-win situation.
Yeah, and you spoke about the urban heat island a little earlier. I should make the point. I don't know if you know Alston Jakubiak's work, Dr. Jakubiak at the University of Toronto. Anyway, he's
The name
tested
is
different,
familiar.
strategies for mitigating urban heat island impact, and the only one that worked was green space.
Hmm.
It was the only strategy for mitigating that showed any sort of success at all. Which so
Hmm.
there's a win-win there in bringing
Definitely.
the life into the city, right?
Yeah, and of course we're absorbing carbon while we're doing that. What the only
As
experts
well.
that know how to do that, trees and plants. So yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about your students for a bit. You also teach. You teach biophilic design at Thomas Jefferson University, and I think sometimes at the University of Pennsylvania when the program's offered. And then you've lectured internationally too. So how do you prepare students? How do you teach students? You know, what's the sort of methodology for teaching them to incorporate these principles of health and well-being into their practice?
Yeah, I've been teaching for since 2017, I think. Um, well, a couple of things. First of all, you may be familiar with E.O. Wilson, from the biologist from Harvard, who was instrumental in biophilia. He's written a lot of books about biophilia, popularizing biophilia. But he spoke a lot about the need for consilience, which means that we need to bring together all these different disciplines to share information. So my courses, I design them in such a way that 2/3 of the students are design students from architecture, interior design, landscape design, and the other third are pre-med students or occupational therapy, biophysiology, physical therapy students. They don't usually meet that much, these different groups, and they meet in my courses. And it's really interesting to see how they, exchange information. The design students tend to understand for the first time a lot of times that this is actually a service profession, that we're not here to build monuments to our own personal taste, but that this is actually that we're in the business of serving the greater good, or i.e. public health, as I make the point. And the medical students somehow empowered to have opinions about that really unpleasant emergency room where they're doing an internship. That is dark, cold, gloomy, no color, tons of noise, and just generally a super high stress environment, that is not conducive to healing, right? So everyone kind of gathers around the issue of the science of emotions and the fact that we experience places and spaces so much unconsciously, as I mentioned, that it becomes almost daunting to contemplate how we could ever, get this right unless we practice reconnecting with our own embodied cognition. So my students, they are forced to do sort of meditative assignments. One excludes vision because we focus too much on vision in my profession to the detriment of other senses. And the other one is out in nature, where they have to literally become acquainted with the life circumstances of a tree in a very profound way. Challenges, scars, water flow. What has happened to this tree? What is the story? You need to be able to observe that. And both professions, design and medical professions, we depend on intuitive, empathetic observation. We can't just look at, a spreadsheet. We have to be a lot more tuned in than that. So we're practicing that. I call that inside out learning. So we're learning from within ourselves. What does it mean well-being? What does it mean to feel well? Because we can't design for it if we don't even know what that means. So being in settings that are homeostatically effective, where some students have actually measured their heart rate and their blood pressure before and after and found that it went down. And I use the term vacation place ingredients with my students because we all tend to follow each other to the same kind of places, flowing water, overlooks, lots of nature, negative air ions in the forests, so flowers. So we know what we need, right? The body says, hey, we got to go to the ocean, to a waterfall, to a flowing creek, because that restores us on a physiological level. So these are physiological preferences that the autonomic nervous system sends us out to find, essentially.
Introducing Solera Reserve from Advanced Glazings, making luxury homes even more beautiful and more healthy using cool, controlled natural light. Right on. Okay. I'm going to sneak one more question in. We're going to do this. 100 years from now, how do you want architectural historians to describe your work?
Well, I feel like we are at the cusp of a new methodology in design where we are redefining efficiency the way I described, first of all, in terms of energy efficiency, carbon footprint, and all of that. I take that as a given, but also the physiological efficiency of built environments. We have not considered that a great deal up to now. So quantitatively efficient and also qualitatively efficient, those two have to be considered at the same time for this to be actually a good building, a building that is sustainable because that's resilient. So we have to be resilient ourselves in buildings that we design. We can't have a compromised immune system. So that is something that I think I would like to be contributing to. We know that our buildings have to adapt to rising temperatures, and we can't do it with the air conditioning button. So how do we make them adaptive? It's the same way a tree adapts, by way of this bark layer, this microhabitat layer. And then also really getting out of our little silo and teaching design students the sciences, evolutionary biology, biopsychology, neurobiology, chronobiology, et cetera, and so forth, because all that is information that we now can use to make more efficient buildings in terms of our neurophysiology.
Love it. All right. I'm at the point where I have to ask my $1 million question, and much of this conversation has already answered that question, but I'm doing it anyway. We'll get a good summary. I ask this question every time, and I always ask our guests to answer from whatever perspective they like. Okay? What makes a great building?
Well, I actually pulled up a quote here from my dear colleague, Tim Beatley, who is a professor of sustainable urban communities at UVA. And he said, I like very much the idea of a blooming building and the notion that we might judge a building by whether and how often it blooms. And that to me is something I also quote in my essay, Buildings as Habitat. It is something that it's such a beautiful quote. It means the building is alive, it's blooming. We have seasonal experience. The building is responsive to the site conditions, to the weather conditions, and it incorporates everything we discussed regarding our own, immune system, our microbiome, the anti-inflammatory effects of all experiences on an up close and personal level. All that is part of it. So this realignment with our innate biology, and therefore with the biology of all of life, including birds, that to me is a great building.
Oh, fantastic. Helena, before we go, do you have any announcements, anything exciting you'd like to share, or anything particular that you'd like to promote that we haven't talked about?
Well, it happens that next week we're actually launching a book at the AIA Center for Design Philadelphia. Yeah, there's been a wonderful series of courses, Drexel University and the Polytech di Milano in Italy. I've been a guest speaker there for many years, and we're publishing a book through Springer Europe, about 20 authors. The book is called Towards a Nature Positive Built Environment. So that happens next week. It's a wonderful collection from design to also urban design management and science and so forth. So yeah, that's happening next week. So one of my chapters, Buildings, predictably called Buildings as Habitat, is in this book.
Well, congratulations. That's wonderful news.
Thank you so much.
All right. Did you tell people how they could get the book?
Well, that's a good question. I don't have one myself yet, so it's just happening. So it should be available through Springer Europe is the publisher, and the title is Towards a Nature Positive Built Environment. Should be
perfect. All right. Helena, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure, and it was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.